Hello, welcome to a special Biophilic Cities webinar event with Michael Mesure, the founder and executive director of the Fatal Light Awareness Program known as FLAPC. My name is Carla Jones, and I am the director of partner cities for the Biophilic Cities project. Since the founding of the Fatal Light Awareness Program organization in 1993, Michael has spearheaded the efforts in Canada to preserve migrating birds from injurious and fatal collisions with man-made structures. This is included, but was not limited to, educating city councils, architects, planners, and construction and renovation companies on bird collision risk on both new and existing structures. Building strategic partnerships and alliances with key organizations and individuals with expertise and concerns with bird migrations and collisions, such as the World Wildlife Fund, Canada, American Bird Conservancy, New York City Audubon Society, and more. He's also assisted the development of bird-friendly guidelines for various municipalities in both Canada and the United States. He's coordinated the recovery of dead and injured birds and the documentation of location and mitigating factors associated with collisions in the Greater Toronto Area. He's co-authored educational documents such as Collision Course, The Hazards of Lighted Structures and Windows to Migratory Birds, and the 12-step bird-friendly building program. He's also assisted in developing the City of Toronto's Birds of Toronto, a guide to their remarkable world biodiversity booklet. And lastly, he presents to countless individuals in the NGO, business, educational, and government sectors. I'm now going to turn it over to Michael. Thank you so much for your presentation today with the Biophilic Cities project.
Thank you, Carla. And thank you, everyone, for listening in. The goal of this webinar today is to provide some background, some insight on how individuals in other cities might consider taking similar steps to what we've done here in Toronto and across Canada in an effort to prevent bird collisions with the human-built environment. Now, what I generally do when it comes to presentations is I ask for a show of hands. How many in a given room have ever experienced a bird colliding with their window at their home or their cottage or their workplace? And vast majority of the time, 80% or more of the individuals in a given room will put their hand up. Now, on an individual basis, this doesn't appear to be such a bad deal, but when you consider the math that every individual you share that space with, whether it's your street, your neighborhood, your city, are all experiencing this in some shape or form, you can understand why this particular issue has become a leading cause of bird death across North America. In fact, it's considered second only to cats. Cats, for the moment, tend to top the list of the most frequent cause of bird death across North America. Now, there's been numerous studies done on this particular issue, and one most noted one here in Canada was back in 2013, where they looked at all the different causes of bird death across the country, and again, bird collisions ranked the second in that spot. The interesting thing about this particular study was it didn't quite capture how many cats that bring birds home to their pet owners, where they were gathering these statistics, were in fact originally a window collision. And it is important that we take that into consideration when looking at this particular issue. Now, one thing that is very important to make clear here, don't let our name fool you. FLAPC's founded name was in fact the Fatal Light Awareness Program. And that is in part because when we started our initiative back in 1993, we were focusing entirely on the nighttime issue of birds colliding with a lit environment. But we, through the years, in fact, just a few years after we started this initiative, we very quickly learned that there is in fact a daytime collision problem. And with that, it is substantially worse than the nighttime. Not to diminish the importance of addressing the nighttime issue, but the fact is that windows during the day are far more lethal in terms of numbers to birds. So the images you look at here, one of a nighttime image, captures a massive flock of birds that refuse to leave the lights of a billboard in the city square here. And then the image on the right captures your more modern type architecture with all its glass facades, demonstrating how lethal the illusion is to birds. But put birds aside, if you ever get a chance to do this, just hop onto YouTube, type into people walking into plate glass windows, and you'll not only have a bit of a chuckle when you see how often people suffer the same sort of trick. It demonstrates again how common this issue is, not only to birds but to even humans. Let me just advance. So quick little bit of background about FLAP. As mentioned, we were formed in 1993. We are a registered charity, and the bulk of our activities at the start was simply from a caregiver's perspective, trying to help birds what we found that were colliding with buildings in the financial district before daybreak. And again, as mentioned, we very quickly learned of the daytime issue. And we'll be getting into this in far more detail as the presentation continues. Our volunteer initiative, we have some 60 to, and it fluctuates between 60 to 100 volunteers randomly doing patrols around specific structures across the Southern Ontario region. We even have individuals outside of the city, outside of the province, in fact, doing patrols in similar cities. But to this point, FLAP remains an organization rooted here in Toronto, branching out to other areas across Canada and into the U.S. The birds that we've salvaged since 1993, we picked up over 70,000 birds from just a select group of structures in the Toronto region. And with that, also 121 species we have encountered amongst those 78,000 birds. When we go about our initiative, picking up birds, we make a great effort toward gathering data, organizing that data, simply because the data that we've managed to recover through the years has proven to be invaluable information for all levels of research. And I'll give you a little bit of background as to what we do with that data, but the bulk of the activity of each volunteer is to pick up those birds, record the details from where they found that bird, and contain those birds inside paper bags if they're alive. Any dead birds are, in fact, tagged with a unique number. What we do with the dead birds is, as I mentioned, there's a tag number with that bird, and it's stored away in a freezer. And this is very important if you ever consider taking on this initiative. A freezer is essential if you are, in fact, going to be containing these birds and tagging them, because you will need a central location to collect these birds. And at the end of each of those migration seasons, we donate those birds to the Royal Ontario Museum. You could find either a museum in your region or a university, educational institute that might want to use these birds for their purposes. At the end of each year, all those birds are pulled from that freezer, and we do a bird layout, which is quite a scene for people to see. If you get a chance to go to our website, you will find numerous examples of these layouts. It's proven to be one of our most valuable ways to educate the public on the magnitude of the problem, because when you lay those birds out, it really is an eye-opener for the vast majority of people. Most people have never seen so many birds in one spot, but not only that, the array of species is quite astonishing. So with that, it is well worth your while to make sure that you implement that effort. We also, through our efforts, we've managed to do research on various bird deterrent products, and with that, we're able to compare the before and after and determine the true effectiveness of markers that are now arriving on the landscape to help reduce bird collisions. And then we also have our light reduction efforts, and focusing again on the nighttime issue. That will hopefully help reduce that level of threat for birds to collide with windows at night. Our mission has been for the longest time working to safeguard migratory birds in the urban environment through education, policy development, research, rescue, and rehabilitation. We did, as I mentioned, start off focusing primarily on the bird collision issue at night, but what we've also found is so much of our effort has now been driven more toward policy development. This has proven to be one of our most vital steps taken to address this issue. Anyway, the policy development is so essential in your efforts in moving forward with these efforts in your city, because what we've found in the audiences that we're trying to shift the mindset of, trying to influence to both reduce light at night and apply bird deterrent markers through the windows during the day are amongst the most reluctant audience to take these steps. And we've learned that as important as it is to work in partnership to the best of our efforts with these targeted audiences, targeted audiences being building managers and real estate investment companies. Unfortunately, volunteerism only goes so far. And it really is your best interest at the same time to parallel try to influence municipalities, try to influence government, to put mandatory requirements in place that will require the industry to take this issue more seriously and take more assertive action to deal with the problem. And I'm going to advance to the next slide here because I'm not going to try and repeat myself too much here. So let's see. Examples of policy development started for us back in 2005, where we developed a partnership with the City of Toronto. And in this partnership, the City of Toronto launched its first of its kind in the world, a migratory bird protection policy. Also was established a program called Lights Out Toronto. Now, there are numerous Lights Out initiatives across North America. Our Lights Out initiative here in Toronto isn't any different. It was an educational campaign to just provide a more in-depth background on the bird collision issue, both by night and by day, and just provide some simple steps that members of the public and industry can take to reduce that threat. And then what came from that was our bird-friendly development guidelines. Now, with the bird-friendly development guidelines, again, the first of its kind in the world, this had proven to be one of the greatest successes of this partnership, because what it offered was, for the first time, some highly detailed information on how the architectural industry, how municipalities, how government can address this issue from a much higher level. And as a result of those first sets of guidelines going back in 2007, it proved to be a template now for numerous guidelines across North America. And we're seeing all kinds of guidelines appear now in other cities across Canada and in the United States, all trying to, at some level, address this from a regional or municipal level. And with that, some incredible changes have taken place. So here in Toronto, after the guidelines came out, they also had something called the Toronto Green Standard. And this was voluntary. This was, again, just a list of recommendations they would provide to architects and engineers on how to build new structures with birds in mind. And with that, it became mandatory in 2007. Now, with that, it now requires here in the City of Toronto, all new construction has to meet bare minimum requirements that address the bird collision issue if they expect their structures to be built. So we're seeing all kinds of new construction here in Toronto that have markers on windows, light reduction practices in place that help reduce that threat. And with that, I would encourage you to, if you are to focus on this in your own city, approach your city council, approach your city representatives, and encourage them to follow suit, because this is becoming a bit of a movement in of itself. And before long, we'll see this happen all across North America at a much higher level. We also work closely with the architectural industry, glass manufacturers, field researchers, and, as I mentioned earlier, city planners as well. These are audiences that are key in helping you move this message forward, because without them, the industry, again, will not take action without those key audiences in place to sort of inspire, perhaps even enforce those changes to take place. As I mentioned, the labeling of birds with unique tag numbers is essential, because wherever you end up sending these birds, they're going to need to have reference to whatever bird they have in hand to understand its history, in order to accurately demonstrate not only its cause of death. And on that note, you'll find that the vast majority of birds you encounter suffer from a level of trauma that may surprise you, and that will come from a little bit further on in this particular presentation. What you'll also find is in your efforts, if you end up doing patrols for birds in your financial district or in your region, some of the challenges you will face is getting to these birds before predators do, and also before humans do. When I say humans, cleaning staff quite often will come out and clean these birds up very quickly, taking them out of the sight of people as they enter the city for their work purposes, or even live in the city for that matter. And so this is one of the reasons why it's been such a challenge to get people to embrace this issue, because they don't see these birds lying on the sidewalks, and so one has to be very diligent at doing monitoring to get to these birds before they do end up disappearing. Partnering with rehabilitation facilities in your area is very important as well, because if it's anything like what happens here in Toronto, some 40% of the birds we encounter are alive, and 10% of those 40% will in fact need some care, some perhaps short to long-term care, that unless you are a rehabilitator yourself, will need to be transported to a facility that can take care of those birds for you. So keep that in mind as a key step that you will have to consider in moving forward. Now, as I mentioned at the top of the presentation, what we find is in the list of predators, scavengers that we encounter are even cats, whether they're feral or domesticated cats, and they will take these birds away. In fact, we've witnessed on a number of occasions at some of these sites where there are feral cat colonies that have learned this to be an alternative food source. And as I said, whether that bird is dead or even just unconscious or traumatized in some capacity, the cats will take those birds away. And so with that, very important that any birds you find be contained, and I'm going to give you some background on that in a moment. Moving forward, when you pick up these birds, you need to consider these 6 steps. When containing a bird, try to avoid putting them in a cardboard box if you can, but if that's all you have, then do so. It's better to put birds inside paper bags. Paper bags, and especially unwaxed paper bags. Unwaxed, if you contain a bird inside it, they're able to breathe inside that bag. And you can punch holes in those bags to assure more airflow. But the moment you poke a hole in the paper bag, it provides a vantage point for a bird to try and escape through. And even though it's a small hole, a bird will very quickly pick that hole big enough that they can slip through. So to avoid that problem, a paper bag is very important. Line the bottom of that paper bag with a paper towel, and just keep an eye on that bird for roughly an hour's length of time. And if you find that bag is hopping around, just make sure that you're able to assess that bird for any signs of obvious trauma that may need attention. Make sure that you scrunch the top of that bag as tight as you can, or even put paper clips on there to avoid that bag from opening again. Place the bird inside a warm, dark, quiet location, and sorry, my phone just went off. And as I said, very important to keep it quiet and warm and out of sight of humans, because any increase in the stress level of that bird can in fact cause more stress, enough to perhaps even have that bird die from that additional stress. Do not feed the bird, do not provide it any water, just contain it, quiet, warm, dark place until it's able to be released or transported to a wildlife rehabilitation facility. What I would also encourage you to do is on the FLAP website, they have something called the FLAP Mapper. And this will, in fact, perhaps help you in your efforts to collect data as part of your exercise in helping recover birds that may be flied into buildings. This database is designed to allow a member of the tool to document bird collisions by simply clicking on the side of the building to which they found that bird. It's a geomapping database that allows you from anywhere around the world. It will locate you, where you stand in front of that building. It's internet accessed, and you simply click on that side. It will drop an entry, and it will ask you for some very basic information that will be entered into that record. It even allows you to enter a photograph of that bird, which we would encourage you to do, because in some cases, actually in many cases, people don't really understand what the species of bird is they're looking at, and it's quite surprising how often you might in fact have encountered a listed species, which is again incredible records to have when reinforcing the message of how serious this problem is and how it needs to be addressed. So with that, we would encourage you to gain access to the mapper on our website, sign on to it as a citizen scientist, and start to use that tool as part of your collection efforts in your city. Just a little bit of background on the various types of architecture, but anywhere from your homes, your garages, your cottages, condos, apartments, bus shelters, vehicles, noise barriers, windbreaks. They're all over the landscape that are there posing a threat to birds, all of which need to be addressed for the daytime issue, need to be addressed by applying markers on that glass. And with that, it's just a reminder of how widespread this problem is and what a big challenge we have. Also, just in the modern world, in large cities, our condos and apartments and office towers are now constructed with its facades almost entirely in glass. Now, the reason for this evolution in architectures it was driven more initially because glass is amongst the cheapest materials to build building envelopes with. When you use stone or steel or concrete, the costs associated with that are far more costly, so they gravitate to the cheaper material. But along with it, aesthetically, the corporate environment, and quite frankly, even at the average individual for their homes, and whether it's a house or a condo, they gravitate toward that aesthetic. And sadly, as that glass increases in the urban environment, we find ourselves increasing the threat to birds. And then just recently, and this is what this last image is illustrating, is there's been this evolution in doing away with spindles on decks and replacing them with transparent glass barriers. It allows windbreaks and security for people, but allows them to sit on their decks and have an unobscured view of the environment. Since this has been introduced into the residential type architecture, the problem has just been exacerbated because of it. Some of the design features that are important to take note of, when you have mirrored glass, or any glass for that matter, whether it is mirrored, tinted, or transparent, reflects the urban environment. And very important that we remember that even because transparent glass is reflective, it needs to be treated as a mirrored sheet of glass. Also, if you have plants inside your home or in your workplace, you need to conceal those plants out of sight so that they aren't as visible to the bird from the outside. And then when other design features of a building will be where two transparent walls of glass meet each other, like you see here in a glass corner, or in a glass linkway where they're seen straight through to the adjacent side. So again, it's transparent, tinted, and mirrored glass presenting this threat. And how that glass is situated on that facade can increase that threat as well. Various types of design features outside of the glass itself need to be considered, all part of your efforts in educating the public. Now, what you need to look at are things like, for instance, in light reduction. Simply turning off lights, you would think would be relatively easy to do, but it does present a challenge in the corporate world. There is a lot of 24-hour activity. So you need to reinforce the message that if you are working at light, well, instead of working with all those rows of lights over top of your head, replace those lights with desk lamps if you are inclined to work at a desk. Even better, close blinds, close drapes, and have lights turned off in areas where people aren't working. It was thought that overhangs and angled glass is a method to help reduce the threat of bird collisions during the day. Research has reinforced that it does help, but such a tiny bit that the cost associated with introducing these additional design features to a building, it's just not worth the investment. You're far better off treating those windows with markers to mitigate that threat during the day. Also, any kind of aesthetic lighting, whether it's landscape lighting, street lighting, or rooftop lighting, that lighting needs to be directed downward. Try to avoid promoting any upward lighting. And in fact, any rooftop lighting should be extinguished because it serves no other purpose than just simply showing off the architecture. I mentioned about guidelines earlier. Here is just a sampling of guidelines that are now sort of blossoming across North America. And if you at any time want to gain access to some of these standards that are available, you can reach out to FLAP. We can give you some tidbits of where to get that information. There's even links on our website that would point to it. But the long and short of this is there is plenty of options now for cities to be able to gain access to these resources, to know how they can adopt this particular issue in their urban environment. Now, something very important to point out. Now, really, this does apply obviously more so to Canada than the U.S., but it is something that I would encourage you to aspire toward. We, FLAP, found ourselves back in 2010 participating in two precedent-setting lawsuits. The first lawsuits of their kind, where two real estate investment companies were held to task at historic bird deaths that were occurring at their facilities. Now, in both of these trials, the parties were let off on due diligence. They felt that they, at the time, did everything they could with what was available to them to mitigate the threat of bird collisions at their structures. And as a result of these trials, there was just this boom in bird deterrent technologies that weren't available on the landscape prior, that now makes it very difficult for anyone, whether you are a corporate real estate investment company, a building operations manager, or even a homeowner for that matter, to not address this issue. What came out of the second lawsuit was it has now been made law, both in the province of Ontario and also across Canada federally, that anyone that harms or kills a migratory bird due to reflected daylight off of glass can be charged under the Environmental Protection Act. And this is in part what had that ripple effect on the industry stepping up to the plate to produce bird deterrent technologies, because suddenly the industry that refused to budge on addressing the issue now was demanding solutions. And so you've seen this right across the United States, all kinds of bird deterrent technologies appearing. And with that, unfortunately in the U.S., there's no concrete law in place to send that similar message. So advocating for this in the United States is also very important. That being said, as great as that sounds, that has not limited us in any shape or form with the challenge of making sure this law is being enforced. Unfortunately, here in Canada, the government is very uncomfortable with this law because it suggests that everyone's breaking the law. Because if you think about it, we all work and or live in a structure that has glass. It's everywhere. And how they enforce such a law is a challenge. Now I'm going to give you some background on how we're helping the government get past that, which you can also bring into your city as well. This being one of them. We recognized that the government was going to have a hard time enforcing this law. So we designed something back in 2013, something called BirdSafe Building Standards. And what it is, it's a risk assessment program. It's an online risk assessment program that allows a trained individual to go out to a specific site and assess each and every facade of that building by following a methodology in this program. And it will produce a report that will identify which of the facades of that building is presenting the greatest threat. Now, this is quite a sophisticated tool. In fact, there are 54 different factors taken into consideration, and it adds up and calculates through an algorithm how that structure is presenting a certain threat greater than others on certain sides of that structure. And with that, the reason the government is gravitating toward this is instead of a building being told your building is killing birds, cover it with markers, what it will do is it will identify isolated areas where vast majority of birds are dying at that structure, making it far less costly for that individual to embrace those markers, apply those markers to their structure, and applies far less of an aesthetic threat to that building owner and operator. They love their shiny glass, and if we can isolate areas to just a few spots around their structure that reduces that threat, that's even better. Our 24 years of gathering data with collisions is the vast majority of daytime collisions are occurring up to roughly 16 meters above grade, which means roughly 4 to 6 stories in height is where 90% or more of these daytime collisions occur, which means, again, instead of a 50-story structure being told you have to treat every side of your structure up to the top floor, this tool will suggest you only need to treat it up to that hot spot level of 4 to 5 stories, which again saves them so much money and far less of an aesthetic threat. And that is why it's so important to really keep this in mind as you go through educating people, because doors will slam in your face if you do not find ways to compromise. And by compromising, believe me, I've done this a long time. I've been doing this for 28 years. I know that if there are not incentives in place, this goes nowhere. So there needs to be compromise, and this is a wonderful compromise to achieve that. Just a little bit of background, there's been 24 professionals that across North America that have produced and weighed in and helped develop the methodology for this report, which means all the world's experts on this issue have weighed in and made this an extremely valuable tool. So if you're at all interested in learning more about this, get in touch with us, because what we are looking to do in the very near future is to train individuals to be able to conduct these types of assessments in their community. And with that, again, I really do believe that this is the step forward in getting this to make change in your environment, in your city, without perhaps even having a law in place. We've also developed the best practices document, again, part of the BirdSafe risk assessment program, and I can give you more detail on that background if you are interested enough to inquire. There are all kinds of bird deterrent solutions now that have appeared on the landscape. Some already existed even before this law came to be, even before these lawsuits took place. What they've now done is they've taken these already existing methods and they're calling them bird friendly, which is fine because technically they would be. So the example that you see on the left-hand side is an example of a sun shield. Again, not at all designed to reduce bird death. It's designed to reduce heat load inside a building. Exterior sun shields are one of those methods. We have printed patterns on glass, which is baked patterns that are adhered right to the glass surface that, provided they meet a certain density of a marker, will meet that criteria. So we have sun shields, we have frit patterns. They now have the ability to silk screen on glass. They have retrofit products, which are window films that repeat patterns on the glass. All these types of techniques, provided they meet the proper spacing and contrast to make glass visible to birds, is essential. The images on the on the right-hand side are to demonstrate what doesn't work. Are things like noisemakers, high-pitch frequency devices, anything that was originally designed to repel birds, say, out of crops for threats of reducing the food being depleted by birds, whether it's a berry crop or whatever it might be. These types of technologies designed to repel birds do not reduce bird strikes. So abandon that. And also the classic bird of prey decal. What people typically do is they would take one of those decals and smack it on their window and think, voila, magically the problem disappears. Sadly, that does not work. You need to reinforce the message that in order for a technique like that to work, the image you now see with all the decals over the window is in fact what your window would have to look like in order to have a lasting effect at reducing strikes. And sadly, no one's going to do this. So again, I'm going to give you a little bit more background. Is some very important element of understanding that's important for you to take away with you. When applying markers to glass, the audience you are educating must understand that the outside surface of your glass, or what they call the first surface of glass, is where you need to treat the windows. The moment you put anything inside that building as a bird deterrent, its effectiveness depletes significantly. And the image you see in front of you was actually to show a transition of what was a transparent, clear view of the inside, but then as daylight shifts, that transparent glass becomes mirrored, and you have very little chance of seeing what is behind it, reinforcing the fact that the marker needs to be on the outside surface of glass. The other part of it is contrast. The marker has to have a strong enough visual signal to be seen. Now, what you're seeing on the right-hand side here is, in fact, a bird deterrent marker that covers that entire facade. And you can see those markers. They're like white dots spaced 2 by 2 inches apart that sort of stand out to you. But what you can't see is that top last row of glass that appears darker has the same marker on it. But because it's being shadowed by overhang, plus because blinds have been drawn behind it, because that marker is on the second surface, you don't see them anymore. So again, just to reinforce, not only the surface is important, but the contrast needs to be strong. And in this case, the markers should have been a black marker instead of a white marker to avoid that contrast signal being lost. More background on this can be seen on our website, or feel free to inquire with us and we can give you more background. One area of technology that's emerged is the UV technology, where we apply markers on glass that the birds see, but we as humans do not. Birds have the ability to see a certain spectrum of ultraviolet light that our eyes do not absorb. And the purpose this type of technology is so popular is because it provides what is believed to be an invisible fix. Our glass would be, on the most part, look the same to us in the future as it appears to us today, where the birds would see that marker. And there's the marker that you see on the right-hand side here is a product manufactured by a company called Arnold Glass. I believe it's called Macaho, and it has UV reflective qualities that are supposed to be captured in the bird's eye. Now, I have all the hope that whether it's Arnold Glass or anyone that explores this type of technology will truly pin down its effectiveness, because research is demonstrating that in some cases, when testing various products adopting UV reflectivity, collisions are increasing. They're not decreasing. And this is simply because, well, not simply, one of the theories is that in nature, the reason birds see ultraviolet is for aids of perhaps identifying food, or choosing their mates, or choosing their breeding territories, which qualify more as attracting the bird rather than sending them a warning that there's a problem. And with that, until they perfect what that proper UV signal is to have be more apparent as a visual marker rather than perhaps an attractant, I would encourage you to put this issue on the side for the moment until they figure that out. I mentioned the trials that took place. One of the first of the two trials, midway through the trial, this particular company applied markers to their building, the first of its kind in the world, that actually embraced what research suggests works to reduce strikes. This, as you can see, almost a 100% mirror coating on this glass, reflecting some beautiful lush environment around the structure. And as a result, we would be picking up anywhere from 500 to 1,500 birds a year just from their two structures. Once these markers went up, we saw over a 70% reduction in bird collisions at that site. Now, it's not perfect by any means, but what a huge reduction, and at the same time, it provided a far less visual threat to the owners and operators. It didn't interfere with the aesthetics of the building. In fact, what they did when the markers went up at this site is they put a damage control program in place to prepare to deal with the tenants' complaints about what's this marker on the windows all about. And instead, they didn't receive a single complaint. So they had to go to the tenants and ask them what they thought of the marker. And the tenants were saying, what markers? They didn't even notice them. So they were quite pleased to see that their aesthetics weren't being threatened the way they thought it would, and what a huge reduction in strikes. So this is just one of infinite ways that one can apply a marker to the window in an effort to reduce bird strikes. Now, with that, what I always say is treat your window like a canvas, because it truly is infinite what an individual can do to make glass visible to birds, while at the same time making your building look unique among the others and aesthetically pleasing as well. And let me just advance this slide. When it comes to homeowners, when you're dealing with that audience, one of the biggest problems with bird collisions at homes are the placement of bird feeders. Research has demonstrated that the closer that feeder is to your window, the better. In fact, half a meter or less is ideal. The further you move that feeder away, you slowly start to increase the rate to which the birds are flying, therefore increasing the potential of fatality due to collisions. And plus the fact that by placing those feeders in proximity to your windows, you're increasing the concentration of bird activity in and around your home, therefore increasing a greater chance of birds to collide. So aside from treating windows with markers, the placement of bird feeders is also essential. So what I always recommend is there's plenty of bird feeders now that you can recommend to people that actually fasten themselves right to the windows. Those are ideal. But with that, what is more important than anything is applying markers in front of that glass to reduce that threat in the first place. And just a little bit of background on architecture as a whole. As I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of work to be done in every city, even those that have standards. To this day, we still start to see new building designs appearing on the landscape. This one just came out less than a year ago, where they put this circular mirror in the middle of in the middle of a park. And I can only imagine what a structure like this is going to do with the immediate population of birds in that vicinity. And with that, it just reinforces the message that we have a long way to go here at changing the mindset of architects, city planners, real estate investment companies, developers. And it's a lot of work, but my goodness, when I look back at when our organization first started, the things that we managed to accomplish this day, I really believed I would never be seen come to fruition in my lifetime. And with that, we have some wonderful momentum going now. We need more people in other cities doing what we do here in Toronto and other cities like Chicago and New York, Texas, I think Atlanta, Minneapolis, St. Paul. There's all kinds of initiatives appearing. And with that, like anything, there's power in numbers. So please do recognize the volume of work to be done here. Change is not going to happen overnight, but we're much further ahead. As a result of sort of laying that foundation, the work involved is going to be far less taxing. You won't have to anymore look like a bunch of crazy people running around with nets in your hand. There's a higher level of respect, both at the government level and the commercial level, that's going to make your job just a little bit easier in trying to make change occur in your city. Some examples of change that has occurred as a result of our work here in Toronto and abroad. There's all kinds of new construction appearing on the landscape that embraces the bird-friendly standards, but has introduced a whole new aesthetic to architecture that is changing the mindset of the world of architects. And it's amazing what something that started out as an effort to reduce a conservation threat is turning out to offer a whole new world of architecture that is far more pleasing to look at. So here we have an example of a university, Ryerson University building, the building that I showed earlier, of the dotted pattern on the glass that was sort of disappearing as a result of the overhang above. This was a construction for the Pan Am Games. It was a Pan Am Center, aquatic center that adopted this methodology. There's others here. This is another university that instead of all glass facade, they used opaque materials instead, and where they have the glass, they used bird deterrent markers on those surfaces, all of which has, again, created this evolution in architecture. So with that, in closing on the presentation, I can only encourage you to, really do consider, initiating a movement in your own city to achieve a variety of things, blending the rescue efforts and data collection in with education, and perhaps trying to create partnerships both in your city and abroad to send that message to your city council, to your various levels of government, to help them recognize and reinforce the message that this issue is not going away. I have had for years been, sort of, I guess for lack of a better term, patronized by, keep up the good work, very admirable what you're doing, but, the change that you're advocating for will never take place. So just all the best of luck at helping those birds that collide with the building. Well, that certainly has changed. And so the more people addressing this issue will help guarantee that movement, that shift in the mindset of all levels of governments and members of the public to take place. So with that, I'll close, and thank you so much for listening in. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us, and we'll do our best to answer those questions. And also, please feel free to visit our website at flap.org, filled with all kinds of information on how you might be able to move forward with an initiative in your city. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Michael. It's a really inspiring presentation that offered a lot of advice for our advocates in cities across the globe to prevent bird collisions. So thank you so much. And please stay tuned for future Biophilic Cities webinars. Have a wonderful day.